Hi and welcome again to a short video focused on helping you with your research critique. Well, before we get into any content, have you found your paper yet? A couple of students have emailed me recently saying that they can't find their paper in their email. If you were enrolled in the course in week 2, you should have received an email from me that outlined what was happening in week 2, but also included the title of your paper. If you cannot find that email, then send me an email and I'll send it to you again. Now, if you have found that email and you've got the title for your paper, but you haven't found your paper yet online, it's a good time to start doing that right now. The lecture break gives you an opportunity to not only catch breath, but also catch up on those pieces of assessment that have been sitting there in the background for a while. Pieces of assessment that have been, sitting in the background and are semester long have a tendency to become a problem in the last few weeks of the semester when you suddenly realise that actually there's a bit more work in it than you first originally thought. The opportunity now is that you at least have a look at the assessment, work out very, very clearly what's involved and ask questions when you need to. But what about finding that paper? Well, there are a number of ways you can do it. You can just copy the title of your paper and drop it into Google Scholar. You can probably just drop it into Google and get Google to search for you. The alternative, of course, is that you head to the ANU Library website and you use the Super Search. Now, to do that, of course, you can head to the ANU Library website. You probably already know how to do that from the ANU webpage. If not, you can just search for it directly on Google or any other search engine for that matter. Click on it, and then when you're there, type in or paste in the relevant words associated with what you're looking for. If I were you, I wouldn't put in the entire text of the title that I sent to you. Maybe just the title itself. Leave the author names out. Or you can put in a couple of words. Of course, that'll increase the number of returns that you get. So put in the entire title. Then, of course, you just browse the results until you find the paper that is appropriate and click on that. Now, these links on the ANU Super Search site will take you direct to the journal's website. And that has presented a problem for a few students because when you're at the journal website, you're given the opportunity, when you have access to the journal content, to download the paper in a PDF form as is indicated here. Now, if you are accessing this content from off-site, that is off-campus, you may find that because you're off-campus, your computer's settings don't give you immediate access to the journal website itself. The journal will ask you to pay something like $25 for a paper. Now, don't do that. You don't need to pay for papers that we've asked you to read in this course, and that's because the ANU has already paid for access to those journals. To access off-campus, what you need to do is to first log into the ANU's or use the ANU's reverse proxy. So to do that, you just type in ANU reverse proxy login to another search engine online and you'll be taken to the ANU reverse proxy website. You log in using your U number and your university password, and you select to log into the ANU library. Now, once you've done that, your computer settings will record that you are logged in through the ANU's reverse proxy and you'll be granted access to the journal PDFs. So you'll be able to download your paper for free. And any other papers, of course, that ANU has a subscription to the respective journals, and ANU has subscriptions to a heck of a lot of journals. Now, I'll cover this in another piece of content, the next piece of content, but a couple of points about your critique. First of all, I want to be clear about what the critique is made up of. Now, I want to separate the idea of a critique from a criticism. It's typical when we're asked to critique something to focus overly on the negative attributes and perhaps find ourselves in a position of judgment, saying that something is good or bad. Well, when it comes to critiquing a paper, you're not asked to make a value judgment about the paper at all. Really, critiquing is just evaluating or analysing the structure of something, and in this case, the structure of your paper. You are not asked to make a statement about whether it's good or bad. Really, just being asked about whether the key elements associated with the paper itself in terms of its structure, as well as the methodological components of the paper, whether they are present or absent, whether a theoretical framework has been put forward, whether it's effective. Now, how will those components be marked? Well, of course, there's a rubric online. And now the rubric, if you haven't seen these before in other courses, I'm sure you have, but here in 1003, you're given a clear rubric of how we will mark things. And we mark directly to these points. There's no other marking in the course. So remember, there are two components to the critique. First, the conceptual critique, in which you need to assess the structural attributes of the paper. The emphasis of that structural critique is on the theoretical framework that is used throughout the entire paper. For information on theoretical frameworks, return to earlier content embedded within the research critique and research writing tile online. So far, we've covered introductions and research and the research critique in general, but also theoretical frameworks. During the lecture break, right now, we're going to cover a lot more material. The methods, results, discussions, conclusions, abstracts, the whole shebang. And we're also going to talk about referencing. Now, in addition to that structural critique, you also need to undertake a methodological critique. And of course, the rubric includes a detailed list of the way that we'll assess that as well. Now, how do you undertake your methodological critique? Well, there are a few things that you need to draw upon. First of all, so far in the course, we've presented the experimental design content. In weeks 5, there were 2 lectures while I was away from campus, 2 lectures that covered the 5 basic elements of experimental design. You need to reflect on that associated with these components of the rubric. In weeks 7 and 8, there will be additional content focused on human studies and the construction of surveys, as well as some discussion around ethics. Those lectures will be key when it comes to answering additional components of this rubric. Now, how do you do it? How do you put this together? Well, there's already a template for you online. Just head to the assessment page, download the template, and you really just fill in these boxes here. Now, don't misinterpret things here. The size of the box is not an indication of just how much text should go in there. It's just a randomly sized box just to fill in the page. So there's a separate component for your conceptual critique, or that structural element, and then the methodological critique too. Use the template. It makes your job easier insofar as writing the assessment, and my job easier when it comes to marking. Also, why not stick to using dot points in terms of addressing each of these questions? Maybe use each of these dot points as a subheading, and then write your answer or your response underneath those dot points. So again, your rubric. Here it is here in detail, in particular focused on the introduction. Reflect back on the introduction video that is already online, read your paper and consider your introduction from these points of view. Does it adequately introduce the question or the problem? And does it do so by presenting a sufficient review of relevant peer-reviewed literature? That is, papers in other journals. Well, other papers in journals, they don't have to be different journals. It's always good to sort of cast your eye across more than one journal though. Are the assertions made, especially in the literature review or generally in that introduction, are they supported by referencing? We'll talk about referencing a little bit more in a moment. And then, do they use this evidence to highlight a gap in the literature that then leads to the identification of a research problem, a research question that is clearly testable? Now, in terms of the methods, so far the content online allows you to address each of these dot points presented in black. You can easily complete, it seems to me, a good portion, most of, the methodological critique right now. Read your method section, have a look at these components and address them right now. You could get this easily knocked off, I would say, in a day. And this one here, well, between the two of them, you'd have a good portion of the major assessment done in a day's time. So let's go back a little bit then, back to the literature reviews, and think about that key element in which is really the backbone of the theoretical framework. Of course, a theoretical framework needs to have logic and reasoning, but it needs to be also based upon the peer-reviewed literature. It needs to be a logical, rational interpretation of the peer-reviewed literature. Now, literature then, and the review of that, is an important element of the work that we do as researchers. Not only do we write literature reviews in our papers, but we are always, as academics, as researchers, always reviewing the literature, keeping up to date, and understanding what new questions and what new methods are out there, getting inspiration from others around us, building our own methods, and then putting those out there for others to make use of as well. So when it comes to literature reviews, what we're interested in are, yes, definitely the outcomes, the conclusions of work that is in the relevant fields of our own. But what we're also looking for are those key new things, the new strong elements associated with new papers. But as an academic reader, we're always keeping an eye open for the weaknesses associated with the existing literature and where the existing literature is limited. When we do that, we don't do so from a judgmental perspective, but rather we do so that we can understand the limits, the bounds upon the knowledge that are being generated in respective research fields, and possibly identify areas in which we might undertake our own work. When we conduct a literature review in a paper, for example, we do exactly these things too. We highlight the outcomes and conclusions of work, and in doing so, emphasise what they did and perhaps what they didn't do, what the authors did and didn't do, and what the constraints are to the knowledge that's been generated. Maybe there may be papers that disagree with each other. Maybe there are similarities. Those are the kind of things that we try to draw out, as well as issues, perhaps some gaps, and some uncertainties, ambiguities that exist within the literature. Why do we do that? Well, a literature review needs to be more than just a list of papers we read and a summary of what they said. This is not just a simple summary. Literature reviews fail when they are nothing more than a statement of past results. What a literature review needs to do is, yes, highlight past results, but draw out the key messages from the peer-reviewed literature to identify where these gaps, limitations exist and synthesise the existing knowledge. Papers, or rather literature reviews that do that, are genuine literature reviews. Otherwise, you just have a shopping list. It is true that many literature reviews written by students are very little more than just a basic summary of the existing literature without that additional component of interpreting where does that literature now leave us. And that's something that as a student you really need to focus on. And that is something that the peer-reviewed literature should be doing, and you should have your eye open for. Now, of course, if we are peer reviewing, then we must include references to the literature that we are reviewing. Remember that the peer-reviewed literature itself provides the grounding theory and lets us identify research problems that our work is based upon. Our work then is the product of a logical argument that is based upon existing literature, and that existing literature strengthens our argument, gives evidence for the argument that we're making. Now, not only are we aiming to bolster our argument, but what we need to be doing too when we're referencing is properly acknowledging the people who have produced that evidence as well. And that is the key element that we're really interested in. We want to know who produced that knowledge. Where does it come from? As a reader, if I want to, I need to be able to go back to that source material and for myself read it and myself test the validity. Think about, really, is that what they said? Well, that's interesting. I didn't get that from that paper. I need to reread it and see how they drew that conclusion. So what it does is it not only gives relevance to the paper itself, but it gives relevance to the argument. So our argument not only needs to highlight a paper, but it needs to use that paper in an appropriate fashion. It needs to use the paper in a consistent argumentative fashion in which it has been presented in the original work. You can't obviously draw an alternative conclusion to that's actually presented by the authors in their own paper. So it gives a piece of work a great many benefits. Now, one of the real benefits associated with highlighting literature is it allows you to shorten your writing, especially when it comes to method sections, where we are often called upon to write about, well, we're always called upon to write about the full methods we've used in a paper. When we cite a paper that has used a similar method, we can truncate that written material quite substantially. And that is true in a literature review as well. We can highlight a series of papers that have perhaps achieved similar findings or undertaken similar work without going into a very lengthy description of that work in itself. Now, while we are on that topic of citing other people's work, let's understand that one of the key things that we are interested in, well, at least in halting, is plagiarism. And I'm just going to stop that video in the background because the constant movement becomes a bit annoying. There we go. Now, plagiarism, as you'd be aware of, is an infringement of academic practice. And the ANU is, like all other institutions, very keen that we police academic misconduct. Now, what is plagiarism? The ANU has clear policies on plagiarism and academic misconduct online, and I'd encourage you to have a look at those on the Wattle site. There is a lot of discussion, though, at the moment around what constitutes plagiarism, especially in the last couple of years in which algorithms have arisen or text generators have arisen online. But this question around what is plagiarism, it goes beyond just ChatGPT. Indeed, online and in journals like Nature, an argument has been put forward by people that borrowing sentences from other papers is really just a part of writing, of improving our own work. And it shouldn't detract from the originality of the rest of the work. Well, I, like many other people, do not believe that that's an appropriate thing. I don't believe that it's appropriate to just copy and paste other people's writing and pretend that it's your own. If you're going to do that, then you need to appropriately reference it or quote. Now, quoting is something that we very, very rarely do in academic writing in quantitative fields in any case. I understand that in the arts areas, quoting and the use of quotations is particularly common. The reason for the difference is that in arts-based writing, the idiom, the voice that the author used that you are citing is of importance. Whereas in academic writing in science or in quantitative fields, that voice is assumed to be neutral. That is, as an author, I do not necessarily have a voice or a particular idiom that needs to be expressed. My expression of my work needs to be as clear, as concise and straightforward as possible, free of personal editorial, if you like. So there is never a circumstance in which I think I should be quoted directly. The ideas that I put forward perhaps made use of and adapted, but not my actual words. There's nothing unique or special about the way that I express myself, especially in my academic writing. Now, it may be difficult to avoid that kind of quotation when you're writing for the first time. Of course, we all read papers and are influenced, inspired by those papers. How do we avoid writing just like those authors? Well, one thing you can do is put down the device, laptop, phone, whatever, and pick up a piece of paper and a pencil and start writing your ideas, sketching out your ideas with your hand on a pencil, writing onto a piece of paper. It's very difficult. In the absence of cut and paste, it's very difficult to write like anyone else other than yourself. Now, of course, you don't write the entire paper that way. What you do is just sketch out the basic outline of what you're trying to achieve, and then build your argument, perhaps in a Word document, from there. Have a look at these links online, as well as the ANU Guide on Academic Misconduct for more information. Or watch Mr. Bean. So referencing, when do we need to do it? I'm sure you've seen referencing content before, but every time you use facts or ideas obtained from another source, you need to reference. Now that's true for even common knowledge, if you didn't know of or you weren't aware of it until the moment that you read it somewhere. Now the questions that you might want to ask yourself when it comes to common knowledge, because often this question comes up, what's common knowledge here? Well, you need to bear in mind that you are writing generally to an audience, and you need to make an assumption about what your audience can reasonably know. They can't know necessarily specifics associated with individual pieces of work, and they don't necessarily know the specific relevance of individual papers to your argument. And so if you're making a specific argument using an idea from someone, you need to reference that. Also, if there's disagreement within the audience in general, or the literature indicates contrary outcomes might be found, then using referencing is essential. Now, what do you reference? We reference everything. It used to be the case where we only used peer-reviewed literature. That is by and large still true in academic writing, that peer-reviewed research is the gold standard that we work with. But there are other sources of referencing material. But what we need to be careful of is just because something has come from the peer-reviewed literature doesn't mean that we can just use it as we wish. One of the really important things that we need to avoid is inappropriate use of references. And there's this wonderful paper that highlights the inappropriate use of citations in marine biology papers. Now, you might wonder, well, how is that relevant to you? Like, you're not studying marine biology. To think that this problem of inappropriate referencing is restricted to marine biology is a fantasy. I have read quite a few papers that inappropriately use referencing. For example, when I started my PhD, there was a very common use of a specific reference that indicated that, for example, the use of eucalypts for tree ring studies was a waste of time and it was simply not possible. And then they cited a particular paper. Now that paper actually never said that, but it was used over and over and over by other authors to illustrate that point. How? Why? Well, I assume at some stage somebody said that, based upon that reference, and then everybody sort of cascaded from there. Be aware of empty citations. Have a look at this paper when you're going to undertake your own writing and understand what appropriate use of referencing really is. How do we undertake it? Well, you'd be surely aware that we use in-text formats to indicate the author, last name, and year in which the publication was made. There are protocols for single authors, two authors, three or more authors, or when we cite multiple papers in the same sentence. Be aware of the formats associated with in-text formatting. Also, be aware of the formats for reference lists that are presented at the end of the document. There are general principles around them, that is, all of the author names, the year, the title of the paper, the journal, perhaps abbreviated, and then the journal volume and the pages from which it has come. Now that's the general format, but understand that between journals, and I can guarantee between lecturers and courses, the expected format will change some. So understand that there are different styles. Harvard, APA, Chicago and MLA are the dominant ones that are widely used. You'll see Harvard used through most courses here at the ANU, but understand that some courses will vary. So understand that different journals, ANU schools, conveners, degrees, different pieces of assessment will have different assumptions about the EndNote style. How do you handle that without wasting an immense amount of your time? Well, you make use of referencing software. There are a number of pieces of referencing software. The ANU supports one, EndNote, that you have to pay for, but not here at ANU. You can download it and install for free. But there are also online versions, Mendeley and Zotero. One of the benefits associated with EndNote is that once it's installed in your machine, you can install this little button here, the Cite As You Write button, in Word. So what that means is once you have entries into your EndNote database, you can simply type, maybe you're writing something about Black Mountain and you want to insert a Puke and Moore reference. You're about to write Puke and Moore, you press on Cite while you write, and you can add that reference as you write, the in-text citation, and at the same time, EndNote inserts a dynamic reference list at the end of your document. No formatting required. Of course, the formatting revolves around an EndNote style that you input beforehand. So there can be a little bit of fiddling in the first instance. Be aware that the ANU Library runs courses in how to use EndNote, and attending one of those short courses could be one of the most effective uses of your time that you actually achieve throughout your entire degree. It will save weeks of effort over the course of an entire degree, making use of referencing software as opposed to doing it manually. Now, how do you, if this is based upon a database, how do you get content into your EndNote database? Well, that's pretty straightforward. Let's say we head to the ANU Web of Knowledge. So we head to the ANU Library page and we see that there's a whole array of electronic resources and databases that you can use to search for and download material. Here I've highlighted that we can go through W to the Web of Science, or Web of Knowledge, and we can search, you can use a search engine there. Web of Science is worth having a go at. Perhaps we type in here, we're looking for Black Mountain, and we go with search and it gives us some results. Alternatively, you can head to Google Scholar and do the same thing, Black Mountain ACT, and we come up with this link here. Now, there's a bit of a trap here, and that is that Google Scholar will include its own citations or citations that it has picked up of that work elsewhere. But you need to be very careful about the structure of those citations. My advice, and the advice of many people, is to not use the structural formatting of a citation as indicated by Google. So how do you avoid that problem? Well, first, you'll see about here, you'll see these little inverted comma marks there. That is to download the citation as Google records it. Do not use it. Rather, click on the name of the paper and go to the journal itself. Every journal page for every paper includes the journal's recorded structure for that paper's citation. Download that and use that as the basis for building your database. That is, you can consistently download papers, download the titles and the reference content into your EndNote library. So surely that's a lot of work. Well, yes it is. Remember that what makes it even more difficult, though, is that different courses vary in terms of the structures, the styles that they want. In the Fenner School, the general approach is to require the Harvard referencing style. Now, it would be really helpful if someone gave you that referencing style so that you could input it directly into EndNote. Well, in this course we do. If you're after the Fenner referencing Harvard style, just go to the assessment page and you can download that referencing style to EndNote and use it in your own pieces of assessment. Also online is the ENVS 1003 reference list itself. So an EndNote database pre-populated with the title of every single paper used in the course. Well, that's it for referencing. In week 7's practicals, week 7 or 8, we will introduce referencing, among other things, to you in the practicals so that you are all familiar with the use of EndNote and are familiar with where you can download it and get more information. The next video will focus on the presentation of methods in research papers, and I'll talk a little bit more about how to critique papers as part of your assessment.